kidding about the hot air.
I'm still Monday, unfortunately.
Been here now 4 years. You know, and every time I come, it's interesting to hear the telling and retelling and re-retelling and re-retelling of the Richard Summers story, of the story of the fight against the Barbary Pirates. And each year as we commemorate Richard's birth and his tragic death in action, we hear lurid tales of millions of Europeans being sold into slavery by the evil, fanatical Muslim pirates of North Africa, of how they preyed on anything they could get their hands on in an effort to promulgate their own way of life. It's a great story. It's just not true. It's how the mythology behind this has become bigger than the fact. The fact is, the Muslim pirates of North Africa, yes, they took millions of people captive. Yes, they worked the poorest of them as slaves until they got ransomed. There were no slave markets in Morocco, in Algiers, in Tunis, or Tripoli, where they were hawking American sailors the way slave traders in Charleston, Wilmington, Delaware, Philadelphia, Richmond, and other cities in America sold black slaves. None of that occurred with us. We were money. We were a commodity. The whole idea of North African piracy was economy. We were the backbone of their economy because, quite frankly, you didn't want your sons or daughters to wind up in a Tripolitan dungeon where they were going to get worked to death by some great big Arab guy. So what are you going to do? If they want $100 to let your son go, you figure out a way to get $100, send it to Tripoli, then they put your son on the next boat headed for the United States. You're $100 poorer, he's $100 richer. That was the whole idea of North African piracy. It wasn't about trying to get slaves. The Sultan in Constantinople ran the Ottoman Empire. All of the Barbary states except Morocco were part of the Ottoman Empire. So they sort of took orders from the Sultan in Constantinople. It's a mouthful. They did so because they were afraid that he would send Turkish troops into their cities and take away what independence they had. This happened in Tripoli in 1795. The leader of Tripoli, whom we fought in 1801-04, was actually overthrown in 1795 by the Turks. His family was sold into slavery. They were shipped off and sold to the Mamluks in Egypt as slaves. But the Sultan realized if we sell European Christians into slavery, it's going to make them a little unhappy, and they'll attack us. And at the time, the Ottoman Empire, while it was huge, wasn't as powerful as it had been. And they were afraid of the Europeans attacking them. So the whole idea of men being sold into slavery, that's the mythology behind this. And we hear of young Richard Summers joining the Navy in a fight against tyranny and terrorism. The idea of terrorism in 1801 did not exist. If you come right down to it, the men and women of the American Revolution, if they did what they did today in another country, we might view them as being terrorists. Richard Summers joined the Navy for one reason: patriotism. In his day, there were no hyphens. You weren't an English American, you weren't a French American, you weren't a German American, you were an American, period. That's what mattered. It made no real difference about your background. What mattered was if you believed in the things that this country, even in 1801, stood for: individual rights, individual liberty, freedom, freedom of the seas. Summers, Stephen Decatur, Charles Stewart, James Lawrence, Edward Preble, William Bainbridge in command of the Philadelphia, all of them went into the Navy in 1797 to fight the French. Say that again, to fight the French. In 1797, the French were in the throes of the French Revolution. And they decided that unarmed, unprotected American shipping looked pretty good to boost their economy. So the French began to prey on our shipping in the Caribbean, which was a lucrative trade spot. In 1798, in March, a group of French diplomats made an offer to a couple of American officials and said, well, for $500,000 in Spanish gold, which was sort of the American dollar of the time, it was the currency to have, we'll stop attacking your ships. Now that $500,000 would have funded the French wars at that time against England, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. We were outraged. How could our erstwhile ally, the French, ask us to pay them the way we pay these Barbary pirates? It was called the XYZ affair. And it outraged America. And that's when a South Carolina congressman said that. Millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. And there was a great outcry in the United States. And anybody that was anybody attempted to join the Navy. The best of the best went into the United States Navy because it was the only way that this country had to protect its merchant vessels and to fight back. And by the time of 1801, when Tripoli demanded more protection money, and again, that was its economic lifeblood. You don't want us to attack your boats? Pay me. You want to go into the Mediterranean past my country? Pay me. You have goods that you want to stop off in Tripoli before you go through the Straits of Gibraltar, heading back to America to get water? Pay me. It was all economy. And it got more and more and more expensive. And finally, Thomas Jefferson said, you know what, we've had it. We're not paying another dime. The leader of Tripoli viewed this as being a break of the treaty that we had signed with Tripoli in 1796, and he declared war. The crew of the Philadelphia fell into Tripolitan hands on Halloween Day, 1803, when the captain, William Bainbridge, who was a slave owner, put the Philadelphia on a reef. And as hard as he tried to scuttle the boat, he couldn't. He wound up surrendering the vessel, giving the leader of Tripoli 302 American captives. He put an original price tag on their heads of $1 million. You want them back, pay us $1 million. The officers lived in relative comfort. They were not worked. The enlisted men were abused and beat up and treated just like slaves. They were never sold into slavery because to do so would have been to wreck his economy. And that's the truth behind the myth. And you begin to look at what motivated these men in 1803, 1804, in Edward Preble's squadron in the Mediterranean to do what they did. Richard Somers knew he had lost the element of surprise on September 4th. He tried on October 31st. He tried on September 2nd to get into Tripoli Harbor with this bomb-laden boat called the Intrepid, with 11 other volunteers. And both times the winds pushed him out of the harbor. He couldn't get through. The Tripolitans knew they were coming. Commodore Preble went to Somers and he said to Somers, you don't have to try a third time. We'll come up with another plan. Somers said, no, I can do it. And he assembled his crew on the deck the day of September 4th, and he told his crew that he would blow that boat up rather than surrender to give the Tripolitans more captives or to resupply them. There was so much material on the Intrepid that it would have resupplied the pirates. Every one of the men on that boat said, yes, we'll die before we surrender. 6 of the men were deserters from the Royal Navy who were serving in the crew of the Constitution and volunteered for the mission. What would make 6 British subjects be willing to die for the United States, if not for the ideals? They were not Royal Navy / Americans. They were not British - Americans. They were Americans. They believed themselves to be Americans. And that's what Somers was fighting for. There was no thought in his head of taking on radical Islam, which, as far as in 1804 he was concerned, Islam is Islam. They didn't know anything about radical Islam like we do today. There was no real connection between what's happening in today's world in terms of radical Islam and the Barbary pirates, because the Barbary pirates didn't want you to be Muslim. If you became a Muslim, they couldn't attack you. And they lost their money. So the mythology makes this somehow up here. But the reality is that these men died for a much more noble cause. They died for a cause that I believe is one that everybody needs to embrace, and that is no more hyphens. Doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter what color this is, doesn't matter what your first language is, doesn't matter how or if you pray to God. All that matters is if you want to be an American. And today, I think it's a time to celebrate Richard Summers' America, an American hero. Not just a New Jersey hero, not a British American hero, not a 19th century hero, but an American hero. A man who gave his life for our nation because he believed in what this nation stands for and in the greatness that this nation could accomplish. Thank you.
Our next guest speaker is Seth Grossman. He's the president of Liberty and Prosperity and one of the co-organizers of this event.
Thank you. Before I begin, is there anyone here who's related to the Summers family or Richard Summers? Because I'd like to stand up. And to the left?
Go ahead, stand up, please.
Yep. Oh, I left? Okay. Anyone else?
If you go back far enough, the Wristleys and Leeds.
Yes. We have some here.
If you go back far.
The reason I bring this up is I think it's very important as we come here to honor heroes like Richard Summers. We ask, why do we honor them? And as Abraham Lincoln said at Gettysburg, we don't honor them to give them more honor than they already have. They've earned it with their deeds. The purpose of these ceremonies is to find out what we can learn from them so we can be inspired, so we can do the things that they did. Because the worst thing that could happen having ceremonies like this is to say, boy, the Americans 200 years were lucky to have heroes like Richard Summers. It's a shame we don't have a lot of people like that today. When in fact, as we have from our descendants, the DNA is still the same. It's what we could learn. It's the certain things. And it's very interesting too, because this is the 10th time I've been here telling and retelling Richard Summers' story. And it's about the 5th time I've listened to Chip Reed tell the story. And it's amazing how, as you tell the story, there's always something. I thought it would be boring to come to the same audience, the same town, the same month of the year, to tell the same story of Richard Summers and say the same story over again. But in 10 years, I've never said the same story twice. And I've learned a lot from Chip Reed. And I can see that Chip Reed has been listening to me and reacting to me. Although I have a slightly different view from my view of it. I read, when I was here a couple of years ago, retired Admiral Ron Denny gave me a very interesting book called The Stolen Village, telling about how I believe it was in 1630, 1620, a Muslim Barbary pirate ship from North Africa raided the village of Baltimore, Ireland, and kidnapped all 320 people who lived in that village, and took them back to Algiers and sold them as slaves. I don't want to dispute facts or history, but I actually read accounts of eyewitnesses who rode back to England, who rode back to Ireland. And as those Christian European slaves were taken off the ship, there was a slave market, and there were bidders. And the highest prices went to the blonde, blue-eyed women because they were in the highest demand. And then the next highest bidders were for skilled craftsmen, the tailors, the carpenters. They were snapped up at a high price because they were worth more to whoever bought them. And what about the people with no skills? They were the worst, the lowest value slaves. And they were sold to the galleys. So they would be rowing behind the oars of the Barbary pirate ships, and they only had a lifespan of maybe 6 or 7 months. and they'd be dead. And then you just buy another cheap slave to replace them. And one of the reasons why the Barbary pirates were so effective in outfighting the Europeans was if the wind stopped blowing, the European ships stopped. But the Muslim ships powered by Christian slaves kept going and were able to overtake their enemies. That's a detail that came out. And after reading that book of that one village, a very controversial book came out called Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, which actually looked at original documents and came up with the figure that between 1500 and 1800, roughly 13 million human beings were taken to those North African ports of Tangiers, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, and processed as slaves throughout the entire Muslim world. 12 million Africans and about 1.25 million Europeans. Now, that was going on for 300 years. And then, of course, it slowed down because the Europeans did start building navies, and they did start fighting back. And so, but the Europeans could never crush the slave trade, and the Muslims could never crush the Europeans. So they had this sort of stalemate where the deal was, okay, the Europeans will pay tribute or money to be left alone, and that is how the situation was controlled. And actually, it worked to the advantage of the big countries like France and England, because they could afford to pay the tribute. So they had a monopoly on the trade in the Mediterranean, and little countries like Holland and Denmark, they were frozen out. So it goes into, yes, the Muslim world was at war against the Christian world, but business came first. And if some Europeans were paying tribute, they would be left alone. The other interesting thing that I thought is this business about radical Islam. Is radical Islam new? Well, we do know that in 1786, America became independent in 1783. And at that moment, we were no longer under the protection of either the British fleet or any tribute being paid by the British government. And one thing about the Muslims of North Africa, they read the newspapers, and they knew that. And as soon as Americans would come over, no longer flying the British flag, they were captured, and they were held for ransom. And Thomas Jefferson at that time was our ambassador to Paris, to France. And John Adams was ambassador to England. They were outraged at this happening. And they turned to the French and they turned to the English saying, we've got to stop this. And they were told by the Europeans, look, you Americans, you have to learn the way of the world. We're not going to get into this endless war with the Turkish Empire or the Caliphate. We made our deal with them. And if you Americans were smart, you would do the same thing. So here's what we'll do. We'll set up a meeting with the chief negotiator for the Muslim states, and you can make your own deal, and we'll tell you how to do it. We'll tell you what the fair price is. And sure enough, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson met with the delegate of the North African, I won't call them pirates, because as far as they were concerned, it was perfectly legal. And Thomas Jefferson said, okay, we're a young country. We're 5,000 miles away. We have done you no injury. Why are you attacking us? What can we do to stop? And the ambassador, and this is all documented, gave a very straightforward answer. He said, we, according to our Quran, our holy book, that we believe that Muhammad was the last prophet. And anyone who does not accept that is our enemy. It is the duty of every Muslim to attack anyone who does not accept that. And if any Muslim dies in that attack, that Muslim goes directly to paradise. And because of that, because our people are not afraid to die, we instill terror whenever we board any ship of anyone who's not Muslim. And therefore, it's in your best interest to admit that we have the right to do this and pay us the money. So Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were astonished by what they heard. They couldn't believe it. So Thomas Jefferson immediately went up and down the streets of London looking for an English translation of the Quran, which he found, which he read cover to cover, and which is still in the Thomas Jefferson Library, and you hear about that every now and then. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson wrote a joint letter to Congress saying, we cannot pay these people, because the more we pay them, the stronger they will become, and the worse it will get, and sooner or later, if we don't stop them, they will become so dangerous, they will really do damage. And at that time, of course, 1786, we had no Constitution, we had no Navy, we were 13 separate states with the Articles of Confederation, and the word was, no, we're not going to build a Navy, we're not going to raise taxes, we can't afford it, we'll give whatever money has to be paid, deal with it. And that's what the United States did. So for the next 15 years, we paid tribute or ransom to keep our people safe in the Mediterranean. And sure enough, just as Thomas Jefferson and John Adams said, the more we paid, the more was demanded. Until not only were we paying the pirates in the Mediterranean, but suddenly the French started attacking our ships in the Caribbean, saying, hey, if it's good business for the Muslims, why can't France take advantage? And that is when the Americans went nuts. And they said, millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. Now there's a little irony there. At the time, Thomas Jefferson was in favor of the French, and John Adams was friendlier to the English. And of course, John Adams had defeated Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1796. And Thomas Jefferson said, don't build a Navy. They don't want to build a Navy. It'll get us into these wars. But anyway, John Adams won the election, and it's true. He built a Navy to fight the French. And Richard Somers was one of the first to join. And it's interesting, as a cadet, by the way, I remember making a mistake. I said that he went to the academy in Annapolis to learn naval warfare. But of course, there was no academy in Annapolis until 1846. But something very interesting. There, the Naval Academy was not in a building. The Naval Academy was in the ships that sailed out of Annapolis. So Richard Somers got his training fighting French pirates in the Caribbean. That's how you got your on-the-job training there.
Wow.
And they did, and I suppose that's why they called them midshipmen, because I guess you had the officers on the top, and I guess you had the crew at the bottom, and I guess you had the students in the middle, and that's how they got to be called midshipmen. But anyway, after winning that victory, America had a Navy. Now, in 1801, Thomas Jefferson defeats John Adams as president. And remember, he was the one who campaigned for years. We don't want a Navy. We don't need a Navy. But as soon as Thomas Jefferson takes office, the Muslims demand more, and Thomas Jefferson sends that fleet to Tripoli. And at that time, Richard Somers was 23 years old in command of a ship out there. And you can see I've completely departed from my prepared remarks, reacting to Chip Reed. I apologize for this, but I just want to go back. The story is fascinating. And I would urge that you go to the Liberty and Prosperity website to learn more. But one thing I do want to point out, in meeting with Chip Reed, I love his stuff. And I urge everyone to buy that book, Intrepid Sailors. The reason I say that is because I actually want to make up for the fact that I looked at one of his free YouTube videos, which I thought was fascinating, because he made one remark in that video, which I think really offers the key to what Richard Somers was all about. He said that, how did Americans from Somers Point end up mixed up with Turks and Christians in this middle of this jihad going on in the Mediterranean? If you don't want to call it a jihad, it was certainly a power struggle. How did we end up there? And Chip Reed said, well, America, after the revolution, had become a naval power, a sea power, because he said people who owned ships in America would, quote, stuff those ships with everything America had to sell. Lumber, bog iron from Badstow, dried fish, grain, tobacco from Virginia, and send that stuff to Europe. And the Europeans would buy it, and then with the empty ships, these Americans would take silk and porcelain and marble and all these things that Europe had, bring it back to America, and make double or triple or 3 times the profit in just one round trip. So that by going back and forth just 3 or 4 times, you could become fabulously rich. And I was actually combining what Chip Reed said about how America became a sea power with what we learned from the Somers Point Historical Society and the Linwood Historical Society, because they will point out how many of the nice homes on Shore Road and Maple Avenue were built by people who were sea captains, who had sailing ships, who made this money, and then after they made enough money, they didn't have to farm anymore. They would move to Shore Road, they would move to Maple Avenue, these wonderful houses, and live happily ever after for the rest of their lives. So, and I started to read some of the history about how that happened. Well, how did people in this area get those ships to stuff them with goods to send to Europe? What's interesting is we go back further. We go back, of course, the first settlers, the Somers, the Risleys, the Smiths, the Leeds, the Skulls, the Conovers that were here. They were farmers, they were fishermen, and when they had stuff to sell, there would be these boats that would come down from New York and Philadelphia, and if a farmer or fisherman had something to sell, they would put an empty basket up the flagpole as a signal that they had stuff to sell. And the ships from New York would come in, and I assume that in Mays Landing they had eggs to sell, which is why I call it the Egg Harbor River, but I'm just guessing here. But you could just use your imagination, because then what happened, so that was going on for a long time, and then suddenly in 1796, an enterprising farmer who had a lot of talent with carpentry was called Christopher Van Sant. And he started building ships on the Patcon River. And suddenly, you can see the farmer scratching their head, why are we selling our stuff for peanuts to these boats that come from New York and Philadelphia? Why don't we build our own boats and go to Philadelphia ourselves and sell the stuff and make more money? And sure enough, when I was at the Liberty and Prosperity meeting at the Shore Diner, I actually ran into somebody named Smith. And I was just relating this. And he said, oh yeah, my great-grandfather, Sam Smith, built a shipyard on English Creek and ran it a couple hundred years ago. So you can just see, once you see the money that could be made, selling, building ships, stuffing with stuff, sending it to Philadelphia, New York, you're going to make even more money. And then you can just picture the conversation going on at Richard Somers' father's place. He had a tavern there at Bethel Road and Shore Road. And what do farmers and fishermen and carpenters and businessmen get together when they're having a few drinks? They talk about business. Well, gee whiz, if we can make our own ships and sell our stuff to Philadelphia, New York, why don't we go one step further? Let's make even bigger ships and sell our own ships to England and France, which they did. And so the people in this area are making even more money doing that. And then I imagine it really got interesting, because I could just imagine those ship owners saying, hey, we could sell our stuff to England and France, double or triple our money in each trip. And in about 3 or 4 trips, we're set for life. And then someone would have said, well, gee, why don't you sell your stuff to Italy? In Italy, you can get 10 times the money as you are going to England and France. But, but you got these Muslim pirates out there. It makes it a little dangerous. But if you do it, you can make 10 times the money. And I could just picture guys, we're big, strong Americans. We're not afraid of no Muslim pirates. And I could just picture Americans going there, and 9 out of 10 of them make it, but 1 out of 10 don't, and that's how we ended up there. So it's interesting, because that's what Richard Somers was going to do. Richard Somers, had he not joined the Navy, he was experienced in sailing ships from New York to Philadelphia. And the final thing with Richard Somers, to point out about these remarkable Americans, he was 23 years old when he commanded his first warship to go from Annapolis to the Mediterranean. 5,000 miles, no GPS, no weather channel, age 23, commanding about 100 guys. Could you imagine, wow. We're worried about, when you're keep your kid on health care until 26. Can you imagine 23-year-old kids today? How did they do that? Of course, they did it because in Richard Summers' time, an 8th grade education meant by the time you were 16 years old, you knew math, you knew reading, you knew writing, you knew arithmetic, you knew basic science. And then you also had summers off. Did you spend your vacations on the beach? No. You helped in a business. So everybody, by the time they were age 18, had a basic education and a useful skill. So by the time Richard Summers was 23, he had 5 years working experience in a real trade. So they were real veterans at age 23. And of course, because they were Americans, people were recognized and promoted by what they did, not by what their father did, not by any political connection. So that's something we have there. So I'm sorry I went way over the time, but I just have gotten so fascinated myself with the story. I hope you will do the same. Now, the one final thing, I hate to be crass about this, but many of you are here because we put these postcards out, 3,500 postcards. We just paid the bill, $400 for the postcard, $400 for the mailing list, $900 for the postage, to help pay for this, so we can keep doing this event year after year. I do hope that we'll go over to the event at Gregory's to help us defray some of the expenses. The tickets are $25 a person, $35 a couple, and that's where we get the money to do this. And I certainly hope that you'll also help out with the mural project and with Sally Hastings of Summers Point Historical Society. Because just by the conversation I had, you ask yourself, why isn't there a Hollywood movie about Richard Summers? Why isn't Richard Summers taught in our high school? Why not in our colleges? Why do we have students are bused from all over New Jersey to go to, say, the Labor Museum in Patterson, rather than to learn about Richard Summers? And you know why, because there's a political message in all this. And Richard Summers, I disagree with Jeff, I think his message is slightly different than the correct message, you may say. So that's why it's our job to keep the Richard Summers stories alive until we can bring that into the mainstream of our popular culture and education. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank the guest speakers that have spoken today.